The Congressional Budget Office released its latest forecast for the U.S. economy today, and the numbers were not promising. This year's projected deficit is almost as high as last year's $1.4 trillion. Joining us is CBO Director Douglas Elmendorf. Mr. Elmendorf, welcome to Bloomberg News. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Sir, talk to us about today's number and tell us how much deeper can the U.S. dip into the red?
Well, by our projections, budget deficits will diminish over the next several years as the economy recovers, but they'll never fall below 3% of GDP, and the average over the next decade as a whole will be about $600 billion a year. At that rate, we're accumulating a tremendous amount of debt, the largest burden relative to the size of the economy since the early 1950s. And interest on the debt will amount to more than $700 billion per year by the end of our 10-year projection period.
Sir, can you give our viewers and give the rest of the country a sense of just how serious this is?
Well, that gap of $700 for 2020, as I said, we're projecting interest payments of $700 billion. That could otherwise, of course, be going to support real current government programs. The gap between spending and revenues that we see ahead is really very large, even under current law, which is the basis of our projections. But if one instead thinks about the sorts of policies that policymakers are discussing, it could be even larger. So, for example, under current law, the tax cuts enacted in 2001 and 2003 expire next year. Under current law, many more people will be paying the alternative minimum tax, the AMT, than have in the past. If we incorporated an extension of those tax provisions over the next decade, that would make the deficit by the end of that decade twice as large as in our baseline projections, and would put debt on a path of pushing up toward 90% of GDP 10 years from now.
Are there any proposals on the table right now that would significantly reduce the deficit and would be sustainable in that sense?
Well, I think that most proposals that will make a big difference in the deficit will have to involve changes in a variety of programs. Because if you think about the size of the deficit, again, looking ahead, not right now during this slow recovery, but even after the economy is back to full employment, the gap is so large. For example, by 2020, the deficit is as large as all of the appropriations for non-defense purposes we expect in that year. So it's going to be very difficult to make a lot of progress without working on a number of different aspects of the budget. And I think the choice for policymakers is how far they want to go in reducing that deficit.
Are eventual TARP repayments going to help to pay down the debt, and how much might they contribute to that?
Our latest estimate of the lifetime cost of the TARP is about $100 billion. That's a good deal less than we thought it might be last year. Not too surprising when you think about it. The financial system has done pretty well relative to a year ago, say, our last annual outlook. The financial system has done well. The banks have been able to pay back much of the money that they received from the government. So that is incorporated into our baseline projections, that good news, and the reduction in the cost of financial market interventions from last fiscal year to this one helps to bring down outlays.
Right.
At the same time, though, the outlays are going up this year relative to last year because of the stimulus package and larger payments for certain benefit programs and for interest payments.
Now, Mr. Elmendorf, as I'm sure you're no doubt aware, tomorrow the president giving his State of the Union address, and he is reportedly going to call for a 3-year freeze on spending on many domestic programs. Will that make a dent?
Well, we haven't received any details of that proposal yet. I know only what I've seen in the newspapers. We will analyze the president's budget when we receive it next week, and we'll publish a report on it in March. But by the description I've heard and the administration's own accounting for the effects on the budget, it seems like it is a step in the direction of reducing budget deficits, but only a small step.
Something else that you mentioned, the stimulus monies, and something else that's sort of been debated as to how much the stimulus has actually contributed to GDP. Is that something that you all have studied?
Yes, we do think that the stimulus package is raising GDP and raising employment relative to what would have happened otherwise. And of course, it's very difficult to know that because we can't observe the economy without it. So we use models.
Can you put a percentage figure on it? Are you able to do that?
We give numbers in the report. We think it's added several percent to the level of GDP currently, but that effect will be waning over time, so that the biggest effect is actually in the first half of this year, we believe. And by later this year and into next year, the effects of the stimulus will be waning. In terms of the dollars going out the door, about $200 billion went out in the last fiscal year, ending last September.
Right.
We think that about $400 billion is going out this fiscal year. That's why the biggest effects are now. And again, we think it's about at several percent of GDP.
Right.
But it's hard to know, and we've offered low and high estimates to try to reflect the uncertainty.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Douglas Elmendorf, director of the Congressional Budget Office, joining us from Washington. Thanks.